She said it to the bar top first, not to me. To the wood grain and the empty glasses and whatever she'd been working up to across the last 40 minutes of everyone else finding their coats and their excuses and their way out the door. She said it quietly, like something she'd been carrying in her mouth too long, and finally had to set down. She said, "Take me home. Just tonight." And I, who had spent 11 months treating Nora Vance like a problem I was actively solving, sat very still and said nothing at all. "My name is Marcus Hale. I'm 36. I'm a senior account strategist at Brennan & Cole, a mid-sized agency that does brand communications for companies that are doing well enough to care about their brand communications. I have been there for 4 years. I have, for 11 of those 48 months, shared the title of senior account strategist with a woman named Nora Vance, who arrived with better credentials than I had expected, a colder handshake than I was prepared for, and the immediate, unambiguous intention of being very good at a job I had gotten used to thinking of as mine. I want to be accurate about this. She was not the villain. I was not the hero. We were two people who wanted the same things in the same building and who had collectively decided, somewhere in the first month, that the most efficient way to handle this was to be professional on the surface and adversarial underneath. We were polite in meetings. We were strategic in who we copied on emails. We did not eat lunch at the same time. This was not a declared arrangement. It was simply the shape we had grown into. Nora Vance was, I am working on how to say this without the language of the lazy, she was the kind of precise that other people read as cold. She prepared more than anyone in the room and showed less of the work than anyone in the room, which had the effect of making her contributions seem effortless, which I found, on some level I didn't examine closely, deeply irritating. She had short dark hair she kept tucked behind one ear. She wore reading glasses she didn't need for distance but reached for in presentations anyway, which I eventually understood was not an affectation but simply the habit of someone who spends a great deal of time looking at small print. She had a laugh she gave out rarely and without warning, sharp, genuine, overfast, and I had noticed it more than I had any reason to. Her prop was a whiskey glass she never finished. Every team event, every after-work drink, 1 glass of whiskey, always the same order. Something neat. Something with a name I would look up later. And she would turn it in her hands and take small sips and leave the last third. I had watched her do this without acknowledging to myself that I was watching. I do not have a compelling explanation for that. The night in question was the agency's quarterly wrap-up drinks. Brennan himself had booked out the back room of a bar called Archer's. Low lights. Long tables, the kind of place where agencies go to feel like they are celebrating something specific, when really they are celebrating the quarter ending. There were 14 of us. By 10:30 there were 6. By 11 there were 3, Marcus Hale, Nora Vance, and our colleague Dev, who was telling a long story about a client pitch that had gone wrong in 3 consecutive ways, each worse than the last. Dev's phone lit up at 11:15. His partner. He looked at it, looked at both of us and said, "I have to. You two will be fine, yeah?" We said yes. Neither of us looked at the other when we said it. And then there were 2. I am not a man who panics. I manage accounts for a living. I de-escalate. I reframe. I find the version of a situation that can be worked with. What I am not practiced at is sitting alone at a bar with the woman I had spent 11 months maintaining a precise and functional antagonism with at 11:15 on a Thursday, with nothing left to manage and no audience to perform for. I said, "I can get the next round if you want to stay a bit." She looked at her glass, the unfinished third. She said, "Sure." Not a yes. Not quite. But she didn't put her coat on. I got the drinks. When I came back, she had moved. Not far, just shifted on her stool, so she was at a slight angle, like she was making room for a different kind of conversation. She had taken her reading glasses off and set them on the bar. Without them, she looked. I noted this without knowing what to do with it. Younger, less defended. I set her drink down. I sat. For a moment, neither of us said anything. She said, "Do you actually enjoy these things?" I said, "The quarterly drinks?" She said, "Any of them. The whole performance." I said, "I think I used to. Now I mostly treat them as intelligence gathering." She looked at me. Something shifted at the corner of her mouth, not quite the laugh, but the infrastructure of it. She said, "That is the most honest thing you've said to me in about 8 months." I said, "We don't generally go for honesty." She said, "No, we go for strategic ambiguity." I said, "You're good at it." She said, "So are you." It's exhausting. The bar was thinning out around us. The music was the kind that gets louder as the crowd gets smaller. She turned her glass in her hands, the habit, the one I had catalogued without meaning to, and looked at the middle distance for a moment. She said, "Can I ask you something and have you actually answer it?" I said, "You can try." She said, "Do you actually think I'm taking something from you? Or is it just easier to operate that way?" I held that for a moment. This is what I mean about her precision. She asked the question that was structurally underneath the other question. She didn't ask, "Do you like me, or do we have to be like this?" She asked the thing that, if answered correctly, would make those other questions answerable too. I said, "I think when you arrived, I had gotten comfortable. I don't respond well to comfortable being disturbed." She said, "And I remind you of that." I said, "You are exceptionally good at your job. It's easier to frame that as a problem than to just know it and adjust." She looked at me for a moment. She said, "You're better than you think you are. For what it's worth. I've watched you in rooms. You read people in real time. I can't do that. I have to prepare for every possible version of a conversation in advance, because I can't do it live the way you do." I said nothing for a moment. This was not information I had expected. This was not information I was prepared for. I said, "You prepare that thoroughly?" She said, "I have 3 contingency decks for the Stanton pitch." I said, 3. She said, 4. Actually, one of them accounts for their CFO being in a bad mood. I did not mean to laugh. It came out anyway. She looked at me with an expression that was, I am choosing this word carefully, surprised, like she had not expected my laugh to be a real thing. She said, "You're not what I expected either. Just so we're being. I had a version of you mapped out before we actually worked together, and it's been wrong for a while now, and I haven't known what to do with that." I said, "What version did you have?" She said, "Talented but territorial. Charm is deflection. Good in the room, harder to read on paper." I said, "That's not wrong." She said, "No, but it's also not all of it." We sat with that. The bar was nearly empty now. The bartender was wiping down the far end. The music had shifted to something slower, not romantic exactly, but with more space in it. She picked up her glass, turned it once, set it down without drinking. I said, "Why do you never finish that?" She looked at it. She said, "My dad used to say you should always leave a little, so you're choosing to go, not being finished." I said, "That's a good principle." She said, "He had some good ones." She said it in the past tense, and I didn't ask, but she saw me register it and said, 3 years ago. Heart attack. Very sudden. I said, "I'm sorry." She said, "Thank you." He would have found the hole. She gestured between us, at the bar. at the general situation, he would have found this very funny. He liked when people figured each other out late. He thought it was more interesting than getting it right immediately. I said, "He sounds like someone worth knowing." She said, "He was." Something in the room had changed, not dramatically. The music was the same. The bar was the same. But the air between us had shifted into something that required more careful handling. She was looking at her glass again, and I was aware, in the specific way you become aware of things you've been not noticing, that we had been sitting close without me registering when the distance had gone. She said, quietly, still looking at the glass, "I've been trying to decide what I'm doing here for about 40 minutes. I said, "Here at the bar?" She said, "Here at this specific stool, talking to you specifically, at," she checked her phone, "11:47 on a Thursday." I said, "And what have you decided?" She was quiet. She turned the glass once more. And then she set it down, the last third still in it, and she looked at me, not at the bar top, not at the middle distance, at me, and she said it. She said, "Take me home. Just tonight." The bar held its breath. Or I did. One of us. I want to be honest about what happened in the following silence, because the easy version is that I knew exactly what to say and said it with confidence, and the true version is that I sat with the specific vertigo of a man who has just been handed something he did not know he wanted until it was in his hands. She was watching me. Her expression was careful, open, but with the preparation of someone ready to close it quickly if necessary. She had offered something. She was waiting to see what I did with it. I said, "Just tonight." Not a question exactly. A return of the phrase. A way of holding it up. She said, "That's what I said." I said, "Nora." She said, "Don't make it complicated." I said, "I'm not trying to make it complicated. I'm trying to understand what you're asking, because I want to answer it correctly." She looked at me. She said, "What's the version where you answer it correctly?" I said, "The version where I tell you that I don't think I can do just tonight, and that this is a problem I've been unsuccessfully ignoring for longer than I'd like to admit, and then ask you if that changes anything." She was quiet for a moment. Her fingers were still on the glass. She said, "How long?" I said, "Since the Carver pitch, 7 months ago. You came into the debrief, and you'd been up since 5, and you still had every number memorized, and you were furious that the client had ignored the third option, and you said, very quietly, to the table rather than the room, that you wondered sometimes if clarity was something people actually wanted, or just something they said they wanted." And I looked at my notebook because I had no idea what to do with what I was thinking. I thought, I would like to know what else she thinks. She was very still. She said, "I didn't know anyone heard that." I said, "I was sitting to your left." She said, "You never mentioned it." I said, "I didn't know how to mention it without changing what we were doing." She said, "And what were we doing?" I said, "Surviving each other." She made the sound again, not the laugh, the infrastructure of it. She said, "That's accurate." I said, "What do you want, actually? Not the just tonight version. What do you actually want?" She looked at me for a long moment. She said, "I want to stop treating you like a variable I have to account for and start finding out if you're someone I could just know, without the structure around it." I said, "That sounds manageable." She said, "Does it?" I said, "I've been managing accounts for 4 years. I can manage knowing you." She said, "That is a terrible line." I said, "I know. I'm better in rooms than on paper." She laughed. The real one, sharp, genuine, over fast. And then she looked at me with her glasses off and her whiskey unfinished, and said, "Okay." I said, "Okay what?" She said, "Ask me something. Something real. I want to know how you do it, reading people live. Ask me something and I'll tell you if you're right." I looked at her. I said, "You came tonight planning to leave early. You had an exit time set. Something changed it." She didn't answer immediately. Then she said, "What changed it?" I said, "Dev's story. You laughed at the part about the second pitch failure, not the third one, which is where everyone else laughed. I think you've been in a room where the same thing happened to you and it wasn't funny at the time, and now it is. And something about laughing at it here made you want to stay somewhere that felt not like work." She was quiet for a long moment. She said, 2 years ago, a client pitch I'd spent 6 weeks on. Same failure mode as Dev's, different reason, same result. I said, "I'm sorry." She said, "I didn't tell anyone here about it. I handled it before I started at Brennan." "But yes, that's the right read." I said, "I told you I was better live." She said, "You did." We stayed at the bar until the bartender said gently that he was closing out the register. We were the last ones. She put on her coat and picked up her glasses and left the last third of the whiskey on the bar, choosing to go, not being finished, and we walked out into the November air and stood on the pavement for a moment. She said, "You know this is going to be complicated at work." I said, "Yes." She said, "I have 4 contingency decks for the Stanton pitch." I said, "I know, that's not the part I'm worried about." She said, "What part are you worried about?" I said, "None of it, actually. I'm finding that I'm not worried at all, which is unusual for me." She looked at me. She said, "Okay, walk me to the corner at least." I said, "I can do that." The first few weeks were, and I'll use the word deliberately, delicate. We were still in the same building, the same meeting, the same strategic landscape we'd been navigating for 11 months. The difference was that we now had a thing we both knew, and neither of us had named at work. She still sat across the room in briefings. I still copied her on the relevant threads. We were professional, which we had always been. The thing that changed was the small, almost imperceptible shift in how she looked at me when I was reading a room in real time. A slight tilt, like someone watching something they'd always been curious about and finally had a front row to. I told my sister about her in January. My sister said, "Finally." I said, "What do you mean, finally?" She said, "You've mentioned her in some form in every conversation since October of last year. Always as a problem. Always as something you were managing." I said, "That's not." She said, "Marcus." I said, "All right." The night Nora told me, not that evening at Archer's, that was a different thing. That was a beginning. The night she said what she actually meant in full. We were in her kitchen on a Saturday in February. She was making tea badly. I had told her twice the water needed to cool, and she had ignored me twice. She handed me a mug that was too hot to drink and sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, "I have something I've been preparing to say." I said, "How many contingency versions?" She said, 3. I said, "And which one is this?" She said, "The one where I say it plainly and you don't interrupt." I said, "Okay." She said, "I know I asked for just tonight, and I know you said you couldn't do just tonight, and I know we've been doing something since then that neither of us has labeled. And I want to tell you that I have not prepared a contingency deck for this. I don't have a version where this goes wrong and I'm fine. I didn't build one because I didn't want to. For me, that's significant. I'm telling you that because I think you should know the weight of what I'm giving you access to." She stopped. She looked at the table. She said, "I love you." That's the plain version. I held the too hot mug and looked at her, this woman who prepared 4 decks for a client pitch, who left the last third of every drink, who kept her father's principle like something to live inside, and I understood that she had just handed me the only version of herself that didn't have an exit built in. I set the mug down. I said, "I've been trying to find the right words for a while," which is embarrassing for someone who writes client messaging for a living. She said, "Take your time." I said, "No. Here's the plain version. I thought you were a problem." "You were never a problem. You were the most interesting person in the building, and I didn't know what to do with that, so I built a structure around it. I'm done with the structure." She said, "That's good." I said, "I love you too." In case that wasn't clear from context. She said, "It was getting there." She made a face at the tea, which was still too hot because she hadn't listened, and I took the mug back and we waited, which was something we'd both gotten better at, and when it had cooled to the right temperature, I handed it back to her and she said, "Better." I said, "I told you." She said, "Don't." Years later, when people ask how we started, and it comes up, at agency events, the story is apparently better than we think it is, Nora says. "I asked him to take me home, and he made it complicated." I say, "She means I was honest." She says, "I mean he made it complicated." What she doesn't say, because she keeps some things close, the way she keeps the last third of every drink, is that she left no whiskey unfinished after that November. She still orders the same glass. She still turns it in her hands. But she finishes it now. I noticed the first time it happened, about 3 weeks after Archer's, at an industry event we'd both been sent to. She drained the glass and set it down and caught me watching and said, "What?" I said, "Nothing." She looked at me with the particular attention of someone who knows nothing is never nothing. She said, "Stop reading me live." I said, "I'm not reading you. I already know the answer." She didn't argue with that. What would you have done if the last person you expected said, "Take me home," and the honest answer meant telling them you couldn't do just tonight? And have you ever had someone you wrote off as a rival turn out to be the person who knew you most clearly? Tell me in the comments if this one landed. Leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.